everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I want to talk about recasting scenes. This is an editing trick or revision thing, something I do a lot with my editor, and really that is what she calls it. When she hits something in my manuscript where it's not quite sitting right or landing right, she'll say recast, sometimes with a question mark if she's not quite sure why it's not working, but most often, super helpful note, she'll say, it isn't working because of this. Can you recast it as this? Or can you recast it generally? That's when I know, it's not working and I have to figure something out. I found that putting that name on it has really helped me conceptualize this in a more concrete way as I am developing as a writer, especially with my editing skills, and I thought it would be useful to kind of share how I approach recasting, give some examples to spark ideas for you. Recasting is essentially taking something that already exists in your manuscript and grafting it onto something new, repurposing it, writing it, editing it in a new way that fixes whatever the problem was. The problem can be a lot of different things. It can be pacing, it can be characterization, it can be tension related, lots of different examples. And most often I find what recasting is really doing is changing something, moving something, sometimes it's moving it to make it more active, more engaging, especially when you are fixing, say, a pacing problem. Some examples of what you might end up recasting: dialogue or a character interaction, an emotional beat, a specific plot point, information, backstory. This can often be a way to solve a show don't tell problem. Reminding everyone, as always, telling isn't bad, but sometimes you are telling in the wrong spots and you do need to recast something into a more active and engaging or showy way. Now, recasting is not a bad thing, and so your goal should never be to, well, I'm going to become such a good writer, such a good drafter that I never have to recast things. Because really that's what developmental editing is. There should always be things in your manuscript that can be stronger, that can be recast, repurposed. Now, over time, as you practice recasting and you have fun recasting, because we're going to talk about set pieces and whatnot, you can often improve your drafting process and you can nail it in one. But inevitably, you're going to have things that you're going to need to recast. It's about recognizing the problem spots and then being able to brainstorm and execute effective solutions to improve your manuscript. Of course, I am fortunate that I do have an editor who's really good at pointing these things out, and specifically my current editor I find is great at suggestions. Not every editor you have, or critique partner, or whomever you're working with to read your work, agent, is going to have suggestions that are going to resonate with you, and ultimately it is down to you, the author, to figure out what the solution is. But I have ended up really liking a lot of Elizabeth's suggestions, and so I find that we have a really good partnership going. But in previous instances, it was always me figuring out how to recast things. And often you'll know what they are. This is that feeling when you've been drafting and you're already ready to jump in and edit because you know that you have to fix things. Sometimes it's because you already know things you want to recast. And that's what I love about this whole process. I think it's why I love editing and I enjoy the act of recasting, because it's the fun part. You already did what I consider the hard part, which is getting an idea onto the page. Well, recasting is polishing and perfecting the execution of that idea so that it lands best with the reader. And it's especially nice that you're, at least rarely for me in terms of recasting, there are going to be things you're going to throw out of your book when you're editing, but recasting isn't about throwing things out. It really is about repurposing. And it's amazing how one little change, one little recasting can completely transform a book. And so that is why I find this whole process really energizing. And I encourage you, if you think of yourself as someone who doesn't like revision, maybe think of it this way, because you gotta learn to love revision. It really is where you make your book better. And this is an essential piece of that. So I thought I would share a couple of concrete examples from my books to give you an idea and spark that inspiration of, oh, those are some ways that you can recast. Two of these, of course, are published, so if you've read them, you'll actually have an idea of what the final end product is But honestly, some of my best examples are from my current manuscript, which is my next YA thriller one, so I have to be a little bit more vague so that you don't get spoilers. But I'm finding that recasting has just been a huge part of the process on this one. And I do find generally that books that I write on contract or on deadline, I end up doing more recasting and editing because I have to write a first draft to deadline. I think inevitably I did a little less on the Ivies because it was done on kind of a different time scale or pressure clock, or I've just forgotten everything about editing that book. You choose. And honestly, I don't remember good enough examples for Brightly Burning. That's the funny thing. I'm sure I did this, but I no longer remember. So we're gonna start with The Stars We Steal. There's one that I have talked about before in the editing video. I think I might have talked about this in my leveling up video. Fans of the channel will know this example, but it's one of my favorite examples. So The Stars We Steal originally had a lot of dinner parties. I just love dinner parties. I had too many dinner parties. And specifically, there was a scene in Act 2, a beat. I knew the beat that I needed to happen, emotional beat. So this is a great example of an emotional beat that I needed to push the plot forward. And I had cast it originally in a dinner scene where like things were said that hurt feelings and people stormed out, and it was fine, but generally the feedback from my editor on Act 2 was that it had like a pacing problem in the sense that it wasn't as propulsive as she wanted. She was feeling that a section was dragging, and I didn't want to substantively change or throw out that section, so it fell on me to figure it out, and it ended up, the magic was recasting. The dinner scene was dragging the pacing, and actually technically I had 2 dinner scenes, so there was some merging going on here too. But this became, if you've read The Stars We Steal, what I call sexy Marco Polo. I realized I should play a lot more with the setting, which is a brand new ship, and have fun with it. Add something to do that would be interesting and engaging for the reader, that would up the romantic stakes, because ultimately it was a 2-prong emotional beat. I needed to basically kind of emotionally punch Leo in the face, poor Leo, and then have Karina have a moment of realization so that they can have kind of there's a turn moment and sisterly bonding, and that was the gist of what I needed to have happen. Sexy Marco Polo came into being, and it was like magic. It was active, engaging. It introduced much higher romantic stakes than anything that there was in the original, and it actually, I changed the kind of substance and flow of the Leo Karina kind of moment and beat there, and I think it became richer and deeper in the recasting. So that's an example there. Another example that I have shared before, this is like a facelift recasting, not so much like a total change, but the first time I wrote speed dating in the first draft of The Stars We Steal, I was very literal. It was just literal speed dating, modeled off of speed dating I have participated in. And my editor was like, I'd like this to be more exciting. Can you do something with the sci-fi setting and technology? And thus this really is like grafting like new skin on top of something that exists. I just rewrote the whole thing to be high tech, and by doing that, it changed a lot of the dynamics. They were no longer like all together in one place. I introduced the idea of the individual pods. That enabled me to, again, extra conflict, extra stakes, because there could be moments of personal intimacy, and I didn't have to work around the public nature of it. It introduced tension because Leo doesn't necessarily know everything that's going on because I isolated her, and I love that scene now. It was like chef's kiss. It really fixed all of the problems that scene had, and problems. It wasn't as exciting as it could be. And sometimes that's simply what recasting is. You don't have the tension, the conflict, the stakes that you need to propel the reader forward, and it could just be better, so you give it a facelift. So in the Ivies, this is when I started working with my current editor, and as I said, she's very, very good at suggestions. So one of these was her literal suggestion, and it was just the right solution for recasting. And so both of the examples that came to mind immediately for the Ivies, I know I did other like forms of recasting, especially minor recasting, but these are the 2 that really came to mind. Recasting can often be a solution, as I said, for telling, but also info dumping. So in my very original draft, so what I sold to my publisher, Olivia also changed in the course of edits, and one thing that changed was there was a bit more of a winking, wry, knowing narrator tone in certain places. And so in the original draft, I had 2 chapters of action without a ton of explanation, honestly. And readers are gonna have different preferences. I know some people may feel there's too much explanation now in the first chapter of the Ivies, but oh well. But originally, it really killed the pacing because I just had the beginning of chapter 3 was, well, I should probably tell you who the Ivies are and why they are important. And my editor was like, recast this, and her idea was to recast that in the prologue. Love or hate it, that is what we ended up doing. And whether you like the prologue or not, it 100% fixed a pacing issue between chapter 2 and 3. It bumped the action along, and it helped that it wasn't as repetitive because some of the same ideas of that do repeat in the scene where they meet in Avery's room. And so it also helped that there wouldn't be similar ideas pretty close together in the text, which is the next thing that actually ended up being recast. So sometimes, and again, very natural in the course of drafting, and also in fairness, in some books it's inevitable. You're gonna return to certain kind of set pieces and scenes repeatedly out of necessity. But sometimes you can find ways to recast them in more interesting ways. And so after this originally was after Emma is killed. I originally had her being interviewed by the police right away. Because actually, originally there was like a memorial funeral scene that wasn't the one at the school. Lots of edits actually happened. But essentially my editor's note was, you have her going to see the police, and then you have her go to Avery's room again, the same beat as before, because they had an all hands meeting in Avery's room before the death, the murder, and you're doing it again. Sometimes that mirroring works, and in this case, her suggestion was, can you recast this and move where it falls to increase the tension? So it became what it is now. It was Elizabeth's idea to have them meet in the bathroom after the memorial / assembly at the school, and then have that create this like rising tension before Olivia goes to speak to the detective. It just made for a much better little mini build arc. It also shortened it, it helped with pacing there, and so that was all my editor's idea. So everything with like checking other people aren't in the stalls and like sitting on the sink and like talking in the bathroom, that was all my editor's idea for recasting. And so sometimes you can end up with mirrors. This led to the mirror bathroom scene that is at the end of the book, which I now love. And this is all because my editor was like, can you recast this in the bathroom? Which brings us to Murder, She Texted, my current YA thriller. And maybe I have the most examples for this because the book had a lot of recasting, but more likely it is fresh. So I'm able to tell you about some instances that truly I feel have transformed the book. So the first instance of recasting, a really just great idea for my editor. And as I said, sometimes when you're in the fog of drafting, like don't beat yourself up that you don't have these brilliant ideas, because editing is beautiful. I had a scene where 3 of my characters, so my main character had basically snapped a pic of a murder board at the police station, and they're sitting around in someone's bedroom going over the evidence essentially and talking about the timeline and suspects. And my editor's suggestion was, she said, this is a little bit passive. Sometimes you have to have passive scenes like this in a book, including a mystery investigation. There have to be moments of kind of sitting down and reflecting and going over information, but I do have plenty of those in the book. And there was one specific reveal on the police murder board, and my editor was like, what if these 3 characters actually go to a place, do some snooping, and they discover this clue. Have it be something that wasn't previously known to the police. Make it active. The reader is there when you discover it. It ups the stakes in a far more interesting way in that moment. Plus it has the double plus of, well, then they have to call the cops, don't they? And then they know that they are meddling, and it turns the screw a bit more there, which is, it's always helpful for tension if you have conflict between your amateur detective and the professionals. So it helped in 2 ways. And that was a scene pretty early in Act 2, like it was in the fun and games motif, and that is way more fun than what I had before. Similarly, there was another scene where I had the character looking up stuff in the newspaper archives. You see, I'm hidden all those small town secrets, amateur detective, like I'm scratching those itches. We love it. Now, I didn't actually completely get rid of this. This is a case where I had a beat. It was fine, could have been more active, but wasn't terrible. Where it ended up being recast, and this actually, this wasn't one of my editor's suggestions. This is actually more me realizing. So I knew that I had 2 threads that I basically needed to touch base with, add a touch point with. They disappeared a little bit too much from the beginning of Act 2 to the end of Act 2, and I needed to come up with a creative, dynamic way to recast something I already had, because I didn't want to add and kind of bloat that part of Act 2. You always have to be really careful with Act 2 drag, and also having your character run in too many different directions. So I took the idea, the beat with the newspaper archive, because the information gleaned was good and a newspaper archive remained the best way to glean at least one of those pieces of information. But what I did is I was like, what if I set it here? And I put it in a new location that enabled me to take some of the other points and basically, it's the tell versus show thing again. Instead of reading something on the screen, I came up with a more dynamic way for my character to observe and see this information, and also put her in a place where she had the opportunity to run into a few characters who I needed to have act suspicious / have her kind of overhear an argument and get those additional kind of threads and clues, because I needed her to be appropriately suspicious going into her next investigation point and into a couple of reveals. Now, I think it's a really fun set piece, way more engaging and dynamic. It scratches the itch of the small town secrets trope in a similar but different way. So before it was the newspaper offices and going into the archive, and now it is like government center, like city hall, but I decided that there's like a town archive / museum, so she can still go on a machine that has the digital archive of the newspapers to get one thing with everything else in a slightly more dynamic manner, and I have a good reason to have these other characters there. And that is really the crux of it, I feel. You're always asking yourself the question, whether you're self-editing or you have a critique partner or an agent or an editor. With an agent or an editor, you don't really have to tell them, can you look for these things? But with a critique partner, it can often help to say, can you let me know places in the book where maybe you were a little bored or you started skimming? Those are great places to think about recasting. Sometimes it's throwing something out, but just as often or more often, it's, can I recast this in a way to communicate the same ideas, the same pieces of information, whether literal or not, in a more engaging, active, dynamic way, in a way that has a lot more conflict, in a way that increases the stakes, or just frankly in a way that is a bit more fun. Some of my favorite examples, clearly the ones that came to mind, they're just more fun. Having a confrontation in a girl's bathroom is more fun. It hits a trope. Having sexy Marco Polo is way more fun than another dinner party scene, as much as I love dinner party scenes. It was definitely a lot more fun to scene set the creepy abandoned building and have my characters find something instead of being like, oh, look what the police found. And so really those are the key things I think you should consider when you're thinking about recasting, especially when it comes to new set pieces. How can I increase the conflict and thus increase the stakes and thus increase the tension? And in doing this, can I fix or increase or improve my pacing? So often I think the thing with recasting, it is about pacing. It's something that you have that you've written in such a way that it's boring. And in recasting, you are making it more exciting, you're making it more dynamic and fun to read. as I said, over time, you'll just get kind of better at recasting. I do think, even though I feel like I did a lot of recasting on this book, I think I've gotten better at coming up with dynamic set pieces from the outset, which is why like I almost never, at least so far on my thrillers, I rarely have to recast things in my Act 3 because I think those set pieces come to me a lot more readily, fully formed before I start. But I give myself permission essentially to not worry about perfect set pieces, all perfect set pieces. You're gonna have a couple of really good ones, hopefully, when you're drafting in Act 1 and Act 2. I mean, technically, in the course of editing this book, I recast the majority of Act 1. But most often I do find myself recasting Act 2 because I think it's pretty natural to lose yourself in the middle, and especially in the fun and games, that's where like a little clever recasting can totally transform the whole book. So I'm curious to know down below in the comments, do you have any questions about this technique? Is this something that you also really enjoy? Do you have like tricks and shortcuts for how to do this really well? And give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and I will make more like kind of tips and tricks about the process of writing and editing that I've learned in the course of my publishing journey. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.